And today's feature presenter is Professor Banny Banerjee. Banny Banerjee is Professor of the Practice at the Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. He is also the co-founder and director of Stanford Change Labs and teaches design innovation and strategy at the Stanford D School. Before his academic appointment at Stanford, Banny spent nearly a decade as a technology innovation lead at the renowned design firm IDEO. His area of expertise is the use of design thinking for strategic initiatives and large-scale transformations directed towards sustainable futures. Regarded as one of the leading experts in innovation strategy in the area of sustainable transformations, he is now working with the Dean of the Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences, Pamela Matson, to shape a new academic program around systems transformation. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Banny.
Good day, everyone. Very nice to meet you, albeit in digital space. Hope to meet you someday in person. What I'd like to speak about today is essentially the types of innovation that you need when the challenges have a certain set of attributes, and particularly those that involve complexity and scale. What I'm going to cover today are a set of topics. I'm going to break it down in this way. First and foremost, I would like to make a case for a certain style of innovation that we call systems innovation. But since we are going into certain nuances of innovation, and the word is used in many ways, I would like to spend some time on innovation itself and define innovation, and then go into two different types of methodologies. One of them is called design thinking, which many of you might be familiar with, and another which we call system acupuncture. At that point in time, you might ask, when do you use what type of methodology? So we will go a little bit into different types of challenges and when to approach, how to pick different methodologies. But in doing that, we will have touched upon issues of scale and some other attributes about scale. But this is also a topic that is very, very relevant in terms of what types of leadership we need for the future. So we'll spend a little time on this notion of transformative leadership. So if we dive in, what I'd like to do before I get into the topics of innovation is take a few steps back and talk about the world we find ourselves in right now. So if we look at the mega trends in the world, a few very, very salient things jump out. One of the things that we found from our previous few decades is that our global economies seem to be increasingly fragile with very stochastic behaviors that are caused by perturbations anywhere on the planet. And so we need to prepare for economic downturns or upheavals in rapid time frames. And our long-term futures in terms of whether it is business futures or in terms of larger issues such as our civilization or societal issues are being questioned by increasing turbulence and large-scale challenges that essentially question the very basis of stability. And of course, as we all realize, our globe now is much more connected than it ever was, but it is not an equitable system, and the sharp inequities cause problems unto itself, as we are seeing in the large geopolitical issues that are prevalent in the planet today. And these are no longer abstract, with political instability and geopolitical shifts that changes the policy landscape or issues of security, etc. In terms of our businesses, we are seeing rapidly shifting markets, very new players, and technology regimes that are changing at an increasing clock tick. But there's something else that's going on. We have, given that we are in the midst of such big changes, and it is not a secret in the general population that we are in the midst of changes, the sensibilities are changing, and who we are catering to with what kinds of definitions of success is changing. And that has a lot to do with how we craft our position and how our brand is perceived and how our value systems are framed. And let's not forget that there are very large changes taking place, such as climate change, insecurity, or questions around continued security around food, water, energy, as we add more than 1 billion people in the next few decades. And then let's also not forget that normally we speak about human issues and anthropocentric kind of point of view, but we are in the midst of an environmental crisis of the sort we haven't seen since the dinosaurs went extinct, and a whole lot of our larger systems actually rely on the fact that we have a stable biosphere. So that's something that is already happening, and we will be getting to 9 billion people on a limited size of a planet, which has already had more resources drawn from it than it can recharge. So these are all very, very large trends, and one would say that, okay, how does it affect my day or my business? But I would like to argue that without keeping this in mind, one might be creating not only overlooking an opportunity to create a better future, but also building in risk into our businesses today or our agendas today. So what I would like to claim is that all these megatrends indicate a world order which is very different from the ones in which our prevalent thinking was shaped. So if we are to meet the future, we should essentially evaluate what is in store for us in the future and what kind of challenges we are facing, and perhaps retool our ways of thinking. And some of these challenges are very large in scale, and we are often motivated by them, or we are in the midst of directly or indirectly working on them. And the question is, to what extent can we move the needles on any of the challenges that we are facing? And also recognizing that not all problems are linear, and a lot of problems are exponential in scale. But meanwhile, what we are very, very good at doing are things such as the line that the S curve shows, and that's when the going is good, where we are able to, we gestate for a period, then it scales up, and then it levels off, and that's when we are successful. But that creates a theoretical gap if the problem is increasing at an exponential rate, and that essentially begs the question, how can we meet nonlinear problems with nonlinear solutions? And then the issue of time. This is the symbol for the time constant. And every system out there has a native time constant, whether it is a business system or an institutional system or a cultural system or the cells in our body or some geological force out there. It goes from seconds to years to eons, but it has a clock tick. And it turns out that the clock tick of change that we are seeing is faster than the clock tick of many of our organizations and many of our institutions. And so we need to find ways of intelligently dealing with the issue of time. So what we are looking at when we take a few steps back is that increasingly as leaders, as people who are managing day-to-day operations as well as big ones, we are looking at challenges that are no longer to be well addressed by business as usual methods, because these challenges are scaled, they're complex, often with time frames that seem unrealistic, and so we need new ways of thinking. So what we need is a kind of innovation, and I'll get into the definition of innovation in just a bit, but of the type of innovation that we haven't really seen before. So we need to, in a sense, innovate on innovation. And what I think we need is a very radical form of innovation that takes on the complexity and the scale and the urgency of the challenges. So I've been using the word innovation. It gets used in very many different ways. People talk of technology as innovation, and often innovations and innovation get used synonymously, and a clever technology is called innovation. The way I mean it is essentially a way of demarcating something that's innovative and something that's not, by saying, does it outperform business as usual? Does it outperform the normative modes of working in order to drive completely new outcomes, completely new behaviors, new paradigms that rewrite the rule books, can we change the behavior of the system and can we send it in a different direction in the future? And that is a different, a broader frame for innovation. So everything I'm going to talk about innovation is with this frame, which is we already have very, very good processes and we've attained a certain kind of operational excellence, but it turns out that operational excellence is not good enough anymore. So how can we outperform the business as usual? Okay, so that's the frame. But I would like to say that this is not just a matter of new processes and skills, but it also involves new mindsets and new leadership models. And the leadership models would lead to new organizational cultures and ecosystems that would allow these processes to take root so that you can outperform the business as usual. Now, mindsets, there are many dimensions of mindsets. Today, I'm going to touch upon a few mindsets, and I'm going to frame a few very key failure modes that you need to watch out for, because if you're falling into that trap, it means that you've written away the opportunities that you get if you are doing systems thinking and if you are doing innovation correctly. So first and foremost, I would say that there is such a thing as innovation blindness, which means that your theory of change or success might not be directed towards outperforming the normative modes. You have an overly, you have placed too big a faith in the current system, and you're drawing your current theory of success based on what you've done in the past rather than what you ought to do in the future. And you're essentially writing away the disproportionate wins you could have if you were to bring in an innovation agenda. Now, what I'm going to do in having kind of framed innovation in this way is that I'm going to talk about two different techniques. And I'm going to talk about design thinking and then go into systems thinking. But design thinking has become quite popular. A lot of you know about this. But I'll give you a little bit of a history and also perhaps a case that will help to explain how I am thinking about design thinking. Now, design thinking came out of the design field roughly around the late 1990s or the turn of the century, where designers realized that what they were being asked to do was not just operational products and services, but they were also being asked to solve questions that were somewhat ill-defined and had to do with things that had to be conceived of in the future. And it turned out that the way designers think is quite different from how different fields operate. So just as engineering is very different from political science, is very different from economics, design is also quite different. And so this notion of design thinking came about, and it started getting used in very many different ways to create experiences of the future to which one could design products and services, or designing systems by the larger systems that did many things with many components, or strategies. Strategies as opposed to tactics, which mean that plans for longer-term futures as opposed to shorter-term futures. And interventions to challenges that didn't seem to be on any one person's agenda, but they needed to be done in a multi-stakeholder way. But also, very importantly, creating visions of the future to shoot for. So in a sense, you need a certain imagination to shoot for a certain future that you want, so that you can direct your plans and your actions towards them. And design thinking started getting used for that. So let me take you through a very simple case. This is a student project that was done at Stanford in the D School, and it's a very hands-on class, and students from all walks of life and very different disciplines get brought into an introductory design class. And this is a journey of a set of students, a team, in an introductory design class. So they were given a challenge and around infant mortality. So in the world, over 4 million of the 130 babies that are born every year die in the first 28 days. And one of the primary causes today is low birth weight, premature babies. Premature babies do not have enough subcutaneous fat in their body to regulate their temperature. So the normative technique for the last over 100 years has been to put them in incubators where their body temperature can be artificially regulated. And so incidentally, the incubator term comes from the poultry industry where the technology was stolen from, incubating eggs. And the modern day incubator costs upwards of $20,000. But a lot of these babies are born in developing countries with lots of social and economic issues, and they cannot afford $20,000. So this team was asked to chop 2 zeros from the cost, make it into $200 instead of $20,000 with the theory that if you could make it cheaper, a whole lot of these countries that have the problem of large-scale infant mortality because of low premature birth, they could deal with it. Now let's look at the journey that these students performed with the design thinking guidelines. So first and foremost, instead of taking a typical approach of slashing costs by looking at the cost of goods and making things cheaper and knock down and making the features simpler, they actually took the trouble to go to the places where this was happening. They went to rural India and Bangladesh and looked at these small regional hospitals in fairly remote areas. And much to their surprise, they found that these hospitals had incubators. They actually possessed incubators. But they also found something very interesting that you must be noticing, that there are no babies in them. So that really puzzled them, and they said, why are there no babies in the incubator? And so they started digging into it, and they realized that actually the problem was that the families to whom the babies were born lived in very tiny remote areas, and they were day laborers, and they could not afford the cost to bring the baby to the regional hospitals. So this is the point at which one of the most important pivots took place. They went against the brief that their partners had given them, and they said, we do not need a $200 baby incubator. We need a $20 baby warmer that can work without electricity, particularly because they also noticed that a lot of these remote areas had intermittent power. So if you had something that would run on electricity and it failed, then the baby would die. So they reframed what the problem brief was. And they came back, and according to the design principles, they brainstormed. The bottom left shows you that they came up with many, many ideas. And they quickly went into a rapid prototyping phase where they tried out many, many solutions in very rough and crude ways. And they bought materials from grocery stores, from hardware stores, and cobbled things together with Tupperware and so on in order to explore the idea and quickly test them. And one of the ideas that came about was, why not make something like a sleeping bag for a baby, but also put an insert in it which was made out of some kind of phase change material, which the first prototype is made out of margarine and wax from a grocery store. And if you put recrystallization is something that can be used to keep the baby warm, and hot water is something you can find anywhere. And so that was the idea that won out among a lot of contesting ideas. And just to give you a sense, they came up with over 180 ideas, and they made over 80 prototypes in a matter of a few weeks. So that's how fast they moved. And then they didn't stop there. They took these to the villages back, and they learned a lot of lessons and lots of failure modes that would essentially take them down in the last mile of concerns by many stakeholders who constituted the stakeholder set. And they learned the definition of the customer, in that it's the entire set of people who can aid or impede your cause. So they found out the opinions of the midwives. They found out about the regional doctors. They found out about people the regulators, et cetera, et cetera. They found out that people are not literate and they might not understand when the thing is too hot. So that changed their brief. So they came back and kept prototyping. Fast forward, these people, after the class, they just started a tiny little startup. They got a fund from a grant from a nonprofit or a foundation, And they came up with a product that is now it's won every design award there is to win. It's being distributed by big players such as GE Healthcare. It has saved tens of thousands of lives, if not hundreds of thousands. They're back ordered. It's made a big difference in the issue of infant mortality. Now, if you look at the system, if you're a hardcore engineer, you wouldn't be impressed. It's very, very simple. Now, if it is this simple, the question to ask is then why did it elude the medical community for 150 years, right? It's not for want of billions of dollars worth of research funding. So here is the secret sauce. The process involved actually taking the trouble to go out and seek insights and deep human considerations, without preconceived ideas, without preconceived theories, being naive and open to what might really be happening, reframing the problem statement in terms of those, and then being extremely generative to create concepts and prototypes, and then testing them so that you can generate insights again. But the big differentiator is that they did not ask the wrong question. They did not say, how can we design a cheap incubator? They said, how can we keep babies alive? And just that difference sends you in a different path. So that, in a nutshell, is how design thinking operates. It's a long process with lots of tools, but at a level of abstraction, that's how it works, right? Now, there are many types of challenges, and one can ask whether is design thinking sufficient, right? Now, if you think a little deeply, one of the things that this did is it looked at some of the failure modes at the human level, and it looked at the lives of the people, etc. But one of the failure modes to think about is that even though this had a certain systems thinking involved in it, there is such a thing as being system blind, where your theory of success doesn't take into account the larger system dynamics and the complex interaction of different factors. So design thinking is absolutely beautiful when it comes to the interface between the system and the human, and often it can change certain aspects about the system. But it's not necessarily a good tool to change the larger system itself. For that, you need a tool such as system acupuncture. And in order to explain what that is, I'm going to explain what some of the distinctions are. This is the Keenavan model by Snowden, and it frames 4 different types of challenges. One of them is simple, the other is complicated, the third is complex, and the fourth is chaotic. A simple is a self-evident system such as a door lock or a French press, or where you don't need instructions in how to work that system. A complicated system is like a car or a Swiss watch, where it's very complicated, many parts, many coupled systems, and you need expertise in order to deal with it. But the subsystems are predictable in what they do, and you can bring a whole lot of what is called deterministic thinking in solving these. Complex problems, however, are ones where there's a dance between many different components, and unless you understand the dynamics of that dance, the chances that you would be able to influence it in the way you want to is low. And you need to understand it in terms of the relationships. So it's like a forest where many components have symbiotic relationships, and that gives you the larger construct, which is the forest. And chaotic is when something is happening because of which the relationships are changing very quickly, like a forest fire, where the processes are something that are becoming increasingly unconstrained, and things are changing very quickly, where the influence you have on the system is very low. Now, it turns out that most of our systems happen to fall in the complex realm, but most of our decision-making cultures and tools are for complicated systems. So we bring the tools of one type of system to a different type of problem, and there lies one of the reasons why we are unable to come up with systemic solutions to systemic problems. And if you have a system that is going into chaotic states, you need to arrest it very, very quickly. And because the level of influence that you have it drops very rapidly, so imagine you're cooking and suddenly the kitchen catches fire. That is not the time to go do your dishes. That's the time to put out the fire before, and you have a small window of time. Turns out that a lot of our larger systems are entering or already into chaotic states, so we need to find interventions very, very quickly to those. So if you are in, and I would argue that there's complexity in the simplest of things. If you are at a dining table conversation with an extended family, that's a complex system unto itself, right? But a lot of the big things that we talked about in setting the stage, we as organizations, as in markets that are changing that rapidly, we are definitely in the complex realm. So the mindset to have is watch out for whether a system is complex or simply simple or complicated. And if there are systemic challenges, they ought to be met with systemic solutions. And if they involve scale, then you have to have your solutions involve scale as well. So if we look at this another way, we can see that there are many ways in which to categorize challenges. But there are challenges that are bounded in nature, where very predictable systems, however complicated, and the business as usual systems work pretty well out there. When you have ill-defined challenges, but where the boundary conditions are fairly tight, such as how do you create a service that is engaging to a diverse customer set. Now that's a pretty open-ended question. However, it's somewhat bounded because all you're dealing with is engagement of a certain customer set. Then that is something that innovation tools such as design thinking is sufficient. However, if you're trying to transform the system itself, that's a class C kind of challenge, and that's where you need more systems thinking and more tools that deal with the complexity and scale. Incidentally, for those of you who are in organization types that have to deal with business success, it is also closely tied to the difference between the red ocean strategies and blue ocean strategies. Red ocean strategies relates to strategies where where the margins are low, there's very little differentiation, where the water is red with the blood of the sharks going after the same food. A blue ocean strategy is where you're able to innovate and create a space where there are relatively few competitors, and you're creating value rather than simply capturing value, and you're creating markets that you get to write the rule books in. The competitors will come, but if you create an innovation capacity, you have created a capacity to stay one step ahead. So these two concepts are actually tied, which also implies that business success is also closely related to working towards future systems that are desirable, and there are ways to do it. Now, we have at Stanford at Change Labs, which I head, we've come up with a methodology which we call system acupuncture, which has many tools and a process arc, et cetera, that I'll go into a little bit. But it involves a theory, a framework, a set of processes and tools that integrate systems thinking, design thinking, and an architecture around scale, a very kind of nuanced way of looking at scale, building in a lot of theories from other fields such as resilience theory, leverage points, economic complexity, but making it very accessible and ways in which one can use it. But also recognizing that the behavioral component and the social component is a very, very large component, and whether or not an innovation diffuses through a community is very important. And there's a ton of research out there which can be turned into principles and design tools, so we do that as well. And we are reframing what technology business and organizational change strategy looks like by looking at the nonlinearity of it and how do you change cultures, but also using nonlinear technology in new ways, new business models such as platform thinking, etc., and a certain kind of integration into not just looking at single outcomes, but simultaneously looking at multi-outcome strategies, and that in elegant ways. So that is what the process looks like. But what we are somewhat fetishistic about is, are we creating scale impact? Are we creating a deep transformation in the system behavior? And if the current system is headed towards a certain predictable future that we do not like, or we are concerned about the stability or the resilience of, can we do something to send it towards a different future and create a position for ourselves where it's win-win? We are able to deal with impending changes or potential changes in ways that we can navigate those waters with better seamanship, and can we actually take charge of the future and position ourselves so that we have more influence in which way this future actually goes. So the direction makes a big difference, but also can we come up with outcomes? The delta is a sign for change. So if we were to take on aspirational goals, and part of innovation is creating extremely aspirational goals and then working really hard to meet them, and my argument is that actually having great aspirations is a very big component of innovation. If you did not shoot for the moon, it would be unlikely that you'd get to the top of even a tall building. You need a large target in order to get there to direct your thinking. So if you have a large chasm between the current massive challenge in the future, how do we get to that? How do we bridge that chasm? And of course, you cannot jump a chasm in two leaps, a single leap. You have to cross a chasm in a single leap. So, or you need to build a bridge. So let's see what you need to do in terms of this philosophy of system acupuncture. First of all, the term comes with the admission that brute force methods are not going to work because you simply do not have the resources. You have to be elegant in how you use resources. And so the metaphor is acupuncture, where you look into the system with enough intelligence to have a theory about where you should place your interventions in clever ways such that you change the behavior of the system and you get the outcomes in the most resource effective and actionable ways, which is also very, very leveraged. So if you look at this chasm, the first step to look at is you need to envision a future that is different, because you are doing that implicitly anyways, even if by placing your belief in business as usual, because you have bought into the vision that the business as usual implicitly has. But if you're trying to change the future, it is worth taking the time and using the tools in order to cast the future anyways. And then you're building a bridge that involves a few steps. So you envision the future. So you actually there's another step before that, is creating the preconditions for success. But then the steps in the innovation process is envisioning the future from a systems perspective, understanding what makes the system tick, and then doing the work it takes to create a theory of change in terms of systems acupuncture points. Now that you have the makings of a strategy at a high level, saying that if we change this, that, and that, theoretically we should change, then you design your intervention, and that turns into more higher level fidelities of platform architectures or process architectures or organization change theories or processes and so on. It can go in many different directions, data plans or market models or what have you, product services. But then you have to turn it into action that has the potential to scale, and you have to think about scale at every step and essentially bake in scale. So that's something that we are going to talk about as well. So that essentially is the arc. But when you do that, what we do is we take a certain lens. We are looking at the behavior at the system level and the human level. We look at everything through the scale lens. We look at the ecosystem of what's happening in the larger ecosystem, not just put the blinders on our technology or our focus. And we definitely take the innovation lens of what can we change in a radical way, in a disproportionate way. We do that in the time we are understanding the system. We do that when we are strategizing and when we are designing solutions. So those are the lenses we use. And so let me say that you could do all of this and still have another failure mode. You could be scale blind. And And that means that you could do something where you somehow had a view that it's going to scale automatically just because the problem is scaled, and that's what motivates you. Your solution is going to scale as well, and you're actually going to be able to move the needle. Well, what we understand from our research is scale is inordinately hard to stuff in after the fact. There's the DNA of your solution. If it doesn't have scale, then you have to get inordinately lucky to have scale. So if you are not banking on blind luck, then you need to incorporate the principles of scale. And first and foremost, you need to become scale-minded. You have to build in scalability at the onset. You need to obsess about it at every scale, and you need to build in nonlinearity if your problems involve nonlinearity. Now, there are many aspects of scale, many dimensions to scale. One can't just go by traditional metrics of numbers. You have to first ask ourselves, can you enter at scale? Or are you, where you have no option of entering at scale, what is going to allow you to scale, to do scaling? That distinction itself is a very important distinction. But scale is always tied to time. It's inseparable from time, because if you had unlimited resources and unlimited time, you would eventually get scale. But we don't have 100 years, and we don't have unlimited amounts of time. So there's a time constant built into scale, so we can't be time blind either, particularly if the problems are running away from us or the industry is changing rapidly. We need to understand the nuances of time as well. So if we have to talk about these things as mindsets for the transformative leader, I'd say some of the top lines, there are many, many different things. But some of the things to worry about is, are we being impact-minded? Are we really being change-minded? Are we wearing the innovation hat, or are we being risk-averse to the point of being risky, where we have baked in so many business processes that abhor failure or are scared of risk, that we've also brought down the ceiling for what kind of ideas can be brought, and either we are losing out an opportunity for occupying a completely different position, or leaving ourselves wide open to other people who would be innovative and essentially upstage us. We have to be system-minded, and that's a whole perceptual lens by which one can look at the world and our work. And this is a very different way of life than procedural ways that look at complicated systems. And for those of you in the technology field, a lot of our training trains us for complicated systems, but not for complex systems. We need to be scale-minded, time-minded, and process-minded. Because if we have a good sense of process and we can hack the processes itself and we are nuanced about how we use a process can be a great proxy for leadership. It gets you those things that extraordinary leadership gets you. And because of our challenges, this is not a single sport. It's not a single stakeholder sport. So we need to find ways to be very co-creative and engaging multiple stakeholders. We need to envision alternate futures and drive towards them. And there is a huge part to being facilitating and catalyzing action, to the extent that you're also creating leadership modalities among people who might be very young or might not have very much experience, but you need to have them fall into leadership modalities. And ultimately, you're creating an ecosystem for systemic change. So what we are looking at is essentially that which a certain kind of leadership that will be able to increase the innovation and the transformation capacity of your team, first of all, of yourself, then the team, then your division, then your organization, including what position your organization has in the industry, the entire industry itself, and in multi-industry, multi-stakeholder, multi-sector ecosystems. And all of that, the degree to which it can be innovated on and transformed is up to how we approach it and what kind of methodological tools we bring to it and what kind of value systems we bring to it. So ultimately, what we are trying to do is move the needle on extremely profound challenges and create a world where we have a place in doing excellent business and we have a position which is resilient and pointed towards better futures. So we need to worry about the potency of the intervention, whether the scale is relevant in times that are relevant, and will it diffuse in scale, and the degree to which it's integrated in the existing complex system rather than being a figment of one's imagination, which is very, very hard to actualize. So I'll end there, and we'll invite some questions. And so I'm looking at the questions, and there are some recurring questions. There are people who are asking about examples of an exponential problem. Well, an exponential problem is essentially where, when you look at from a systems perspective, it is typically caused because of some kind of a feedback loop where A causes B, B causes C, and maybe there are many steps later. But if A causes B and B causes C, but C causes A again, then the effect is also contributing to the cause, and it creates a feedback loop. And particularly if you have a high gain rate, you can actually get an exponential problem. So and at a planetary scale, the fact that we have lost a whole lot of our polar ice caps means that a whole lot of white reflective landmass is being replaced by dark absorptive landmass, and the heat gain is increasing, which means that the temperature of the oceans is increasing at a much faster rate and causing the ice to melt even faster. So this is an example of a feedback loop. But if you find any rapidly changing equation, particularly if it's tied to a population issue. So if you have a finite resource such as water or energy is not exactly finite, but at any given time the capacity over a short period of time might be finite. But then in that time frame, if you have a rapid increase because of population pressures or an influx into the city, etc., then you're seeing a certain kind of, you might have feedback loops where some issue is being raised not at a linear scale, but either at an exponential scale or with step functions. And you see that both in positive and negative ways. You could get sudden collapses in systems, such as if you get hit threshold functions in the level of density in a city, the entire the transportation system can come to a grinding halt, and that's a nonlinear effect as well. So there are some other questions here. There was a question about the VUCA world. I think that those of you who attended another webinar by Julia, she mentioned the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's exactly what we are talking about. That's another term for the big backdrop that I explained, that we are in an increasingly VUCA world. And even those of you who are in industries where you feel that you have captive markets and you have technology portfolios that are that you can trust, and market positions that you can feel very confident about, think about how rapidly the established industries have been disrupted in the past. Think about the transportation industry, the hotel industry, and you know who I'm talking about, right? Now, let me read the questions. So there was a question about the three bubbles that I used in the arch, and while I talk about that, I'm going to try and move back to that slide, if I may. So the three bubbles was essentially at the stages. This is a slide. At each stage, there is a certain lens you can have. Now, the perceptual lens is the lens you have when you look at something. So if supposing you have a scenario such as a cafe, and there are all these people who are working, some older people, some younger people, some people on computers, some people and some people who are discussing with paper, and some people who are just chatting and having coffee, and you four people come into the room. And one of them is an engineer, the other is a social scientist, the third is an economist, the fourth is a structural engineer. I'm exaggerating, of course, but if you ask them what you see, they would see completely different things. One person would see, look how many people of different racial types and origins of ethnic origins. Someone else would look at, hey, look at how snazzy the technology is, and everybody's on Wi-Fi, and everybody's connected, and everybody's on cell phone. Somebody else would say, wow, look at the building structure, and this is happening, this kind of building is happening in a seismic zone. I'm wondering if they have structural support behind the buildings. You just see different things with the perceptual lens that you come in with. So that's implicit in everything that we do, and it makes our vision sharper in certain things and duller in other things. So if you are in a technology-based company, you look at the world through the technology, which is of course something you need to do, but there's a risk of having the hammer, everything looking like a nail. And what we say is that there is no way to avoid a perceptual lens, so we will choose which perceptual lens we should have, and we will look at it from the point of behavior and behavioral frames. There are many ways in which to decode behavior and de-spaghettify behavior. We are going to, I said we have to obsess about scale, so there is a nuanced way in which you're asking the scale question in understanding the problem and solving the problem. When you're understanding the problem, you're saying, what are the scale dynamics? What is change? What are the dynamics that are causing things to change? And what are opportunities to enter in scale? And you're not just saying, look, just if you're in the food business or you're in the energy business, you're not just looking at energy. If you're a modern day organization that is related to energy, you're not in the business of selling electrons. Energy is a lifeblood of the economy, and it touches all our lives, and there are a million ways in which systems are changing, which has an energy footprint in it. And there are many, many ways of looking at much better and sophisticated ways of looking at energy that you can only glean and understand if you look at the larger ecosystem of different things that are happening, sociological changes, different actors, value chains, supply chains, technology emergences, etc. And innovation, I already explained that you have to be very aggressive about that, okay, with common sense, we get a certain kind of answer. But common sense is not common sense. You have to do better than common sense. You have to do it such that an ounce of thinking should get you a ton of results. And it's a mindset, and it's an innovator's mindset. And just because people are giving you constraints that seem impossible, it just means that we have to get smarter, and we have to create win-win strategies. So one of the examples of innovation mind frame is very often we pit the short term against the long term. The moment we pit the short term against the long term, we are saying that we are not going to be innovative enough to meet both criteria. So we actually say, let's do the short term first, or let's just focus on the long term. But if you're innovative, you should be able to take on both, and just by putting that frame, you will find solutions. Okay? So let's see. With a few minutes left, I'm going to pick a few other questions. Transformation capacity is not a small feat. It is, and it's not a small answer. Is the starting point to transform organizational mindsets to believe that they can transform? So the question is around, given that the aspiration of big transformation seems enormously hard, where do you start? And what are simple places to start? And if you look at the change models of change itself, of transformation, and if you're in an organization, the way to think about it is the small changes can have a disproportionate effect. And instead of trying to create a blanket change in your entire organization and saying, oh my God, my bosses, you should meet my boss, they'd never agree to this. Or you should meet my board, they'd never allow you to do it. Or do you realize how constrained my industry is and when I'm, and how regulated my industry is and so on. Or do you think that the shareholders are going to tolerate this, etc.? These are questions when I do work with large organizations. This is standard questions. And yet, it is possible to actually create change in very strategic ways, but also simple ways. Change your team. First of all, think about how you yourself are going to change. But change your team, but also create small centers of change, small interventions of change that have a way in which to expand. And so there is a whole, so yes, organizational change and change in organizational culture and mindsets is a very, very important dimension of change, and that is one of the first things you should target. But one of the ways in which to do that is to also target some highly practical initiatives that will serve as a vessel for that change. So you're all delivering on new product strategy at the same time as which you're making changes internally. So what would be a good strategy that we can apply to forecast the future of a particular industry? Now, that is so you're trying to essentially gaze into the future, and you're essentially saying, look, a lot of it is changing. And so what you're going to, the best way of doing this is, I would say, two tools. One of them is a broader systems mapping, identifying the forces at play and the dynamics that influence your industry and your industry influences. So those two aspects. So if you understand what is influencing your industry and what it influences, and then also figure out whether there are feedback loops out there, and ask yourself what are the dominant drivers and what among those are changing. And the second tool is essentially foresight, which is essentially saying what are the events that are probable that could happen that are not necessarily highly likely but could happen, or what are the bigger changes that are happening and what does that mean for our industry, and essentially going through a process, and then you essentially prioritize the drivers in terms of probability and salience, and that gives you a map of where your industry is likely to move. You can find gravity wells that would have, and markets that are opening up that will suck your industry in that direction or create impediments.
Well, thank you very much, Banny. We're at the top of the hour here, so unfortunately we'll not have enough time for additional questions, but hopefully you all have enjoyed the webinar and information that has been presented as much as I have. I'd like to encourage all of you again to visit our website, globalimpact.stanford.edu, and find out more information about the program that we'll be offering in September, and hopefully we can see many of you with us here on campus. And with that, I wish you all a good rest of the day, and look out for the recording of the webinar, which should be coming to you within the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you in person in September.